The year was 2009 in the history of the cosmos. It was a warm summer and a good time for Metroid. The initial Prime trilogy had just wrapped up, and Nintendo announced a game, the concept that I love to this day. It was an action-focused Metroid game developed by Team Ninja. People were hyped. Little did they know, the game to follow would ruin the series for years. 1 year later, the game would be released as Metroid Other M. Critics liked the game, but Metroid fans were either mixed about or hated the game. Soon, the core Metroid fans would hate the reviled game even more, as it kickstarted the second time Metroid was in the so-called Dark Age. The only game that came out of it was, well, a lackluster multiplayer handheld spin-off. 7 years later, at E3 2017, two Metroid games were announced. Metroid Prime 4, a game we have still yet to get, and Metroid Samus Returns, a remake of Metroid 2 for the Game Boy. Around this time, a 14-year-old Alex was a new fan of the Metroid series. This was thanks to the Geek Critique, and believe it or not, I was hyped. I couldn't believe a new game had come so soon, especially when it looked so excellent and absolutely nothing like Other M. Many others were just as hyped as I was. However, there is a dark underbelly to this story. A year prior, a fan remake of Metroid 2 made by a small team over a decade was released. Nintendo struck this wonderful game down and DMCA'd the creator. I managed to track down a version of it, but it still stands. Nintendo has this weird bias against fan games. With AM2R, I believe it was just timing. I'm sure Samus Returns was in development when AM2R released in June of 2016. Nintendo struck it down to avoid competition. Something similar happened when Capcom was remaking Resident Evil 2. Fans were making a remake of Resi 2, and so was Capcom. However, instead of just shutting down the product and saying, screw you to the fans, Capcom invited the two people working on the remake to see what they had of the official remake so far, and even had a lengthy discussion about game development with them. I feel like Nintendo could have gone that route, but I also want to point out that AM2R is a different kind of remake to Samus Returns. AM2R stays very close to its source material, being Metroid 2. Samus Returns takes a lot more liberties, modernizing and changing Metroid 2 for mostly the better. This can be seen best in Samus's moveset and design of each area. In AM2R, they added a lot of Samus's most iconic abilities, like Zero Mission did before it. It also feels like a GBA or SNES Metroid game. That's partially why I always play with a PS4 controller. It's the most similar to an SNES controller that has functionality with my PC. Samus Returns feels like its own thing, not only due to the 360-degree aiming and melee counter, but because of the way that Samus controls as well as the new Aeon powers. Plus, for the most part, the only power-ups in the game were the ones found in the original Metroid 2. Because of this, I feel like there'd be no direct competition, especially since AM2R was free. Don't get me wrong, both games are great, but they are completely different. This review won't be like my normal ones where I normally analyze a single game. In this one I'll be analyzing 3. That's the twist I mentioned in the Medieval review. Anyway, I'll be analyzing Metroid 2, AM2R, and Samus Returns. At the end I'll compare all 3 to each other, and I'll be going just as in-depth as I usually do. In fact, probably even more so, as I have a lot more to say about these games individually than I did Medieval. This means I'm going to spoil everything. Nothing is safe at this point. If you care about that sort of thing, click off the video as it's integral to my critique. Now, I'm immediately going to say that I'm directly biased against this game. Before I bought the game on my 3DS, I knew the movement was slow, and that the game itself was more akin to Metroid 1 than Super Metroid. I knew I wasn't going to play this game more than once, at least not for a while. Super was the first game I actually got more than an hour out of, and I'm so glad I started there. I much prefer the movement in Super and Onward alone. Plus, despite the linearity, the map can be confusing, and there's no in-game map. On the topic of linearity, people call Other M or Fusion the most linear Metroid game. However, I think as far as progression goes, this game is. Don't get me wrong though, this game is still a Metroid game with hidden upgrades. One big change I didn't like about this game was that your beams don't stack, aside from a few places where all beams are accessible at once. This means that you need to run all the way back to get all your beams. And the main part of this game is the Metroids have their life cycles and stages. I like Metroid stages in concept, however they're very boring in the original Metroid 2. You can just spam missiles. I bought Super and Metroid 2 from my 3DS on the same day. I had already owned Super, but I wanted it on my 3DS because I wanted more downloaded games on my 3DS, but you know, I'm getting sidetracked. I hadn't played Metroid 2 before. Either way, I had played both for about 3 hours. In 3 hours in Metroid 2, I fought 2 Metroids, struggled with movement, navigation, and screen crunch, with no footage to show for it. However, in 3 hours of Super Metroid, I started the game, got to Kraid, skipped the wave beam for the Spacer, and skipped the high jump to beat Kraid. Got the Varia suit and got the high jump. The movement matters so much, and so does the tedium of the game. I segmented Metroid 2 into 30-minute increments, and I actually had to force myself to stop playing Super on my 3DS to play Metroid 2 more so I could have it to talk about. Now I'm going to talk about more stuff that I like in Metroid 2, in order not to make it feel like it's too bad in its own existence. I like the enemy designs. The Metroids look cool, and while I think that their Samus Returns redesigns were better, I still like these a lot. I like the level and area design, and I think the only thing that kills the design for me is the lack of a map. Unlike the Geek Critique, I actually don't mind the music here. I don't even mind the temple theme. I like the general progression of this game a lot. In fact, I think it's this game and its remake that have the best power-up progression in the series, specifically due to the sheer amount of missile upgrades. You're always getting something. My final bit of praise is the jump. While I dislike the speed movement, I think that the jump is great, and it's with the basis that Super used. The progression system is also very nice, like I mentioned before. There are a certain number of Metroids in each area. You can pause the game to see how many are left. Killing every Metroid in each area will result in acid lowering. It's a good progression system that's backed up by the new recharge points. After Metroid 1, these are an amazing addition and a breath of fresh air. As you go deeper, the Metroids get bigger and scarier. Despite this, all you really need to do is spam missiles, but whatever. The final boss is epic for a Game Boy game, and even if the other 2 remakes did it way better. I can't fault it though, considering the hardware. Overall, I don't have a lot to say on Metroid 2. If I'm honest, what holds the game back is 2 major issues for me. For starters, the movement is too slow and clunky. Hell, Metroid 1 feels better to play in my opinion, even without the long beam. If the movement was on par with Metroid 1, I think I'd be a little bit more happy. I understand it's because of screen crunch, but I still feel like there are a few workarounds. Mario Land 1 and 2 made it work. If it felt as good as Super, I'd have a lot more to say. The second main issue is the lack of a map. The pause menu is basically non-existent, so maybe they could have put it there like Super did. Hindsight's always 20/20, but the main thing that kills the first 2 Metroid games for me is the lack of a map. I don't even care about stuff like the ultra snappy movement or wall jumps, because I've only ever used them to break sequences or do tricks to save seconds. And sometimes myself. Anyway, I just want slightly faster movement and a map. But most of all, a map. If there's a ROM hack out there that adds those 2 to Metroid 2, I might give it another shot. I know I've been really harsh on the game, especially since it's a Game Boy game, but I held the other games I have here today to just as much scrutiny. I didn't feel like it was fair to give the game slack when I didn't give slack to the others. AM4 asked the same question that Zero Mission did. What if Metroid 2 was made 2.5 decades later? Well, let me tell you, it nails it. AM4 takes a snappy movement of Zero Mission, the graphics of Zero Mission, the map of Zero Mission, and the heart and detail of Zero Mission and brings it to SR-388. That already fixes 2 of my biggest issues and makes the game look so much better all at once. AM4 is the most accurate of the 2 remakes, and it makes Metroid 2 actually bearable for me. Zero Mission is an amazing game, and if you watch my top 10 games list, you know it's my favorite 2D Metroid. The art in this game is beautiful and stylized, nothing goes out of place. The Metroid 2 locales are more detailed and easier to navigate due to the new in-game map. Speaking of, even the interface is cool. It looks like what I imagine Samus's in-suit computer looks like. The best part of the graphical overhaul is the smooth gravity effects. You get the ice beam last, and when you freeze enemies, instead of staying airborne like they do in the normal 2D Metroid games, they fall down, and the animation looks so smooth. I am not a huge fan of the oddly stock-looking explosions, but I can look past it due to the awesome visuals otherwise. The music here is awesome as well. I prefer it to the orchestral mixes found in Samus Returns. There are remixes of songs found throughout the first 4 Metroid games, and Zero Mission, those others being Metroid 2, Super, and even Fusion. The best part about these tracks, though, is that in most cases, they don't even stick out as remixes, they sound original. They aren't as compressed, and the instrumentation looks a lot cleaner and higher quality than that found in the GBA or even SNES. This is mostly due to the fact that the GBA had no sound hardware and relies on processor cycles to produce its music, cutting performance. However, my gaming PC has $140 worth of sound hardware in it between my TV and headphones. Yeah, don't get me wrong, Zero Emissions tracks are great, but I like these better. Before we move on, how about we take a listen to a few of my favorites? But what's a stellar presentation without good gameplay? Well, The Last of Us 2, but I digress. Aim towards gameplay is pretty standard for post-Super Metroid stuff. What changes are here is the added quality of life changes that Dr. M64 added. He's the creator, by the way. For one, the spider ball doesn't suck as much as it used to. It's a lot faster. What's more is you can go directly to the spider ball from standing with the press of just 2 buttons. Along with zero mission-like movement, you can pull some crazy stuff off. You can toggle power-ups on and off like in Super Metroid, which is fun if you want to challenge yourself in some way. Save points are now full of recharge points, which is very nice. You now can also toggle and change many different options to add filters and shaders. This is pretty standard for PC games, but it's a brand new thing for Metroid. Probably the most monotonous part of the original game was that the sheer boredom of the Metroid fights was a lot. Spam missiles and win. Here, they're a lot more dynamic with varied and/or dangerous arenas. Samus Returns does this too, but in a different way. There are also new boss fights that weren't in Metroid 2. Plus, a lot of the similar areas were changed to be a lot more unique, with different areas and new enemies, meaning that new upgrades, boss arenas, and opportunities for sequence breaking are present. Why don't we talk about that? The game starts off on the surface, but this isn't really an area to say. It does contain an Alpha Metroid though. This area is nearly identical to its Metroid 2 counterpart. With that said, the Golden Temple, or Area 1, is also very similar. This will be a running theme. The M2R version is a lot more tightly mapped with more dense areas. Fight a few more Alpha Metroids and gather 2 energy tanks and get the bomb, Spider Ball, and Charge Beam. This is a very good opening that shows you the ropes Metroid style. Just like the other Metroid games that came before, it forces you to test your skills on a boss directly afterwards. While the boss isn't hard, it teaches that other enemies will require to use missiles that aren't called Metroids. It also teaches you that dodging will be important for fights later. Before I move on to Area 2, I want to elaborate on that. Dodging is way more important in this game. Samus does not take damage like she does in Super Metroid, but she tanks better than Fusion. This is further compounded due to the fact that the later Metroid stages can and will knock you onto your back, meaning you'll be hit over and over and over again. Even early on, Alpha Metroids are much harder than in Metroid 2 and even Samus Returns, as you cannot hit their faces, and instead are forced to get under them and hit their exposed jelly weak spots. I'll talk about dodging more in my Samus Returns section. The Hydro Plant, aka Area 2, is really unique from the Metroid 2 equivalent. You can see yourself going through pipe mazes, fighting Metroids, and even fighting an updated and reworked Arachnus. Here you get the high jump, Variasuit, Wave Beam, and defeat Arachnus for the Spring Ball. There are 2 E-Tanks again, and as always missiles, super missiles, and power bombs, some of which you have to pack track for. I like to get the Spring Ball early, it's mostly just a convenience. The Hydro Plant is a result of the devs wanting to make the temples more interesting, and it's something he did with almost every temple. This is a sewer system that the shows are used, and you traverse it in many different ways. There are points where you need to use your game sense and perception to break a suspicious block to get in. You need to bomb walls, break walls, and use these tubes to get to different areas. There's even a little area where you need to drain water to progress. This is also the first place that you fight Gamma Metroids, which you won't see too many of until the next area. Speaking of the next area, it's a spire down to the industrial plant, which is the next temple. This is one of my favorite areas, and I really like the puzzle where you can use an enemy to break super missile blocks which you don't have access to yet. It took me a second to figure out what to do, but it was fun nonetheless. There are only a few Metroids here and a lot of upgrades. You get the Speed Booster, Spacer Beam, gain access to super missiles, and get the Space Jump, as well as 2 E-Tanks. Yeah, you get it. When you get the Space Jump, you can also fight an all-new boss again. You fight the Torizo from Super Metroid, but this time, he has a second phase where he's a freaking jetpack. This is a nice way to test your new Space Jump. And I wish I was recording Mike when this happened, because I'd totally forgotten that this was included from when I watched Geek Critique so long ago. Before we move on to the next area, you can do something that blows my mind. You can get log entries like those in Metroid Prime 2. These are just as detailed, and if you continue onward, you'll find yourself at the research site. This is a place where more Alpha Metroids are, super missiles, and has this weird looking elevator that will be important later. Afterward, you can head directly to the tower. You'll find your first Zeta Metroids here. Fighting each one is obnoxious in some way. This one will knock you into spikes, doing way more damage. This one is in the dark, enough said. Finally, this one can knock you back through the loading zone, restarting the fight. Fun. At least the upgrades are nice. However, to get the good stuff, you must restart the power unit in the center. I missed the plasma beam? Yo, what? Alright, I'll take it. Okay, this is a... Okay, the door wouldn't have opened that way anyways. This is an interesting room. Oh. Oh, okay. Alright. Alright, things just got real, guys. I didn't even know about this. Oh, jeez. Oh. Yo, I think I need to update my script. Oh, ho. This brings light and new enemies to the tower. On top of getting to new areas, you can fight a boss that reminds me of something. Something, from another remake of a Metroid game. Anyway, this boss isn't exactly like Diggernaut though. Instead, you'll have to break through its armor while dodging projectiles on the scale of a bullet hell. After that, blast them with your beams. As you saw the video, I got kind of low fighting this thing. You can get the plasma beam right after, which is really cool. The bombs and power bombs are mandatory though, and bring the real cool stuff. This area doesn't have any mandatory upgrade bosses, but instead a classic escape scene with a mini-boss in it. After rushing back to the blast doors you passed on the way to the bombs, you realize that you just made it. While this chase is technically scripted, it's still extremely satisfying. So cool, dude. With the new power bombs, that elevator opens up for you. Well, you can go up it normally. That's dumb. Just jump up there. It's fairly easy. Up here is the airship for the rescue team for the research team. There's a secret boss up here that I won't spoil. I think that all you Metroid fans will get a kick out of that. Afterwards, you navigate deeper to encounter a rescue team in your first Omega Metroid. These things suck to fight, but not in a cheap way. Imagine the Zeta Metroids, but with more health and attacks. They can't be easily cheesed. Afterwards, you head to the Metroid's hive. You fight 3 more Omegas and then enter a winding tunnel devoid of enemies. A few larvae and then the final boss, the Metroid Queen. Now, the Game Boy version of Metroid 2, in it, the Metroid Queen was a massive damage sponge you had to spam missiles at. While spamming missiles is still true here in AIM2R, the boss has more attacks, is larger, and even moves around plenty. And every time the Queen moves to an area, the music stops. And after she breaks into the next room, the music comes back with a bang. I struggle with this fight a fair amount, but eventually the Queen tries to swallow you. And provided you have enough health and missiles, the Queen dies. You know, if you know the secret technique. With that, the baby Metroid is born. You now take a long walk through a winding, silent tunnel. Realize that you missed a single upgrade in your first playthrough, cry, and the game ends with this.
The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
Now, why did I spend so long on this game? Why? Well, I'll tell you. This game is a fan game that seems official, minus the part that I'm playing it on a PC. Then again, I had to emulate Metroid 2 to get footage, but whatever. The point is, Metroid 2 is bogged down by its technical limitations, but AIM2R was not. This is like if there was a zero-mission equivalent to Metroid 2. Now, I'll tell you how I feel about this game later, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This is the version of Metroid 2 I've played the most. When this game was announced, I was super hyped. The game pretty much is only Metroid 2 in structure, though. This game changed almost everything. I'll get into that when I actually start talking about the game, though. Samus Returns has an amazing art style, and is so fluid and nice that I was able to beat the game using a broken circle pad on my first run. My old 3DS had the rubber piece broken off from so much Smash Bros. On 3DS and Samus Returns. Both games wreck circle pads. Either way, this is a testament to how well this game plays, when I can use a sharp, tiny, hard plastic nub, smaller than the second circle pad on the new 3DS, by the way, and win despite the fact it was my first run. Samus Returns controls are also a bit too ambitious for the 3DS. There are no new features for the new 3DS, and literally every button is used besides ZL, ZR, and the nub. All the face buttons are taking up for jumping, toggling Aeon, shooting, and countering. The D-pad selects Aeon abilities, and there are several touchscreen buttons used to switch beams. L and R are also taken up by the 360-degree aiming and toggling missiles and power bombs respectively, like in Fusion. This means that the control style is a bit clunky, and it takes a bit of getting used to. But you will adjust. It's just not intuitive as AM2R's controls, and the ability to use the D-pad to move is something that I would really wish was, an option. I mentioned earlier that these guys went crazy with adding and changing stuff. The most obvious change is that it's a jump to a 3D game. This means the team could get a lot more creative with the backgrounds in this game. I play with a new 2DS XL, so I don't get this, but the 3D in this game is insane. I witnessed it on my first playthrough on my 3DS, which was the original XL model. The world of SR-388 is brimming with character and life, even more so than in AM2R. There are a lot of tiny details in the backgrounds that make SR-388 more realistic and lifelike with how much plants and wildlife move around. It also has gameplay use as well, specifically in the Diggernaut boss fight. Samus Returns also brings new prospects of both combat and exploration. I'll start with the combat changes. The first major one is that you can now press the X button to pull off a melee counter on your enemies. The more you progress, the tighter the timing, but it is always signified by a little flash before the enemy attacks. This generates a kind of fuel called Aeon. We'll get into what Aeon does in just a second. The next combat feature is the ability to aim in 360 degrees. This does impact exploration a bit, but it can be really useful for certain enemy encounters and positions. Warp points also allow you to fast travel, which is nice. Finally, we can move on to probably the biggest change in the entirety of the 3DS remake, the Aeon abilities. The Aeon abilities do a little bit of both. The first one is the Scan Pulse. The Scan Pulse uses a bit of your Aeon gauge to reveal hidden breakable blocks as well as parts of the map. This is nice as there are no map rooms. I kinda wish AM2R had adapted the system like this for itself. I use the Scan Pulse constantly in my 100% run, and after trying to go without it my first hard mode any percent run, just couldn't, and I decided to start using it to make my run a 100% run again. This does not mean I hate exploration, quite the contrary. The Scan Pulse only shows small areas of the map and hidden blocks. That just means I don't have to waste a power bomb or bomb at every possible tile to get 100%. The next one you get is the Lightning Armor. This uses up your Aeon gauge the more you get hit, but shields you from all damage. This can make the later bosses a joke if you've collected all the upgrades, and can definitely help with these parts, where you have poisonous plants attached to you until you touch water, or these sections with thorny plants. It also makes your melee counter huge, but it costs Aeon now instead of generating it like before. I like this upgrade. Yeah, it can absolutely destroy the difficulty of some bosses, but it does require Aeon to use and does not negate hit stun. And Metroid fights are still dynamic and deadly, so don't expect to be able to tank literally everything with it. Trust me, it doesn't work. And, once again, it doesn't destroy the difficulty in Fusion mode either. The third Aeon power is the Beam Burst. This allows you to fire at such a rate that nothing can contest you. It can also be used to destroy certain environmental obstacles that glow slightly when you hit them with your normal beam. This also turns you into a combat god in most situations. You can tear through anything. You basically become heavy from TF2, but with a larger radius and somehow more DPS. This one doesn't work on Metroids, however, so I really wouldn't recommend trying it on those bosses. The final ability is Phase Drift. This is basically the speed booster on demand. This power will drain Aeon steadily, but now you move so fast that time appears to slow. This allows you to cross gaps of frail blocks. This has barely any combat use, as when you counter an opponent it turns itself off, but it's still kind of neat. I wonder what it looks like to others though. The most important change to combat comes after you beat the game though. Fusion mode makes your bulk comparable to Fusion's system. This makes the combat much more difficult, especially early on. I played through Metroid Fusion and Fusion mode side by side. Each was my first playthrough, and genuinely here, playing Fusion helped me get better at Fusion mode, and vice versa. I wound up getting better at dodging in general. I'll be using AM2R footage from both my original playthrough and my second of AM2R, with the second coming directly after I finish my Fusion run, and even being on hard mode. This is pretty stark contrast. Now the map here is almost completely different, but aside from the new moves and Diggernaut, there isn't really a more huge differences aside from the existing bosses. Metroids have multiple attacks in all their stages now, and they can be countered for cinematic attacks. Their AI is also surprisingly smart, and is by far the most complex they have been. The difficulty is a bit lower from AM2R because they have multiple weak points, but I can see why they did this. The Alpha and Gamma Metroids in this game actually address an issue that the Geek Critique had with AM2R. They have different variants with different strategies and attacks, meaning the most common Metroids here are much more exciting. The Metroid Queen is the most threatening she's ever been, with many phases and complex patterns. It's way more complex than the AM2R one, with multiple strategies to counter each one. A lot are actually kind of like a bullet hell, which is very unique for an official Metroid boss. And it only shares one thing from the original. You still have to bomb the Queen's stomach. And once the Queen goes down, that iconic scene happens once again. Now here's where AM2R and Samus Returns split dramatically. The ending tunnel isn't peaceful and triumphant, it's full of enemies and other upgrades. I think the Geek Critique missed a point on this, and I think this comment said it best from that video. I had an epiphany a few days after I saw this. You know how you said the tension the first game tried to implement on the way to the final boss is totally missing in the remake? Like they totally missed the point? I don't think that they missed the point. I think Mercury Steam left that long, empty corridor out because that's not how the story goes anymore. When Metroid 2 came out, there was nothing in continuity but the first game. I don't think the fact that the Metroids were created by the Chozo even existed yet. Save maybe in some supplementary materials only a handful of people had actually read. Therefore, it made sense to show SR-388 had been ravaged by the Metroid menace. But Fusion established that the Metroids were deliberately put there by the Chozo to keep in check something far worse, the X-Parasites. So of course the lower tunnels of SR-388 are still full of life. The Metroids haven't been feeding on them. They've been feeding on the X, allowing the planet's ecosystem to grow and thrive. Now they're the protectors of SR-388, not his plague. And sure, if their numbers started growing out of control, they could end up wiping out life on the planet, but thanks to visual storytelling, we know that the Chozo made sure that wouldn't happen. The Chozo built a series of checks and balances to keep the Metroids from overpopulating. Checks and balances that were working perfectly fine until you blundered in. Really, the remake in hindsight is much grimmer than the original, because in this version it turns out that you're the bad guy of the game. You're not the righteous space warrior exterminating a race of evil aliens like you thought. You're the villain of an eco-film, whose ignorance and thoughtlessness end up dooming an entire world. We actually see this in the epilogue where an X infests a native animal, signaling the parasite's eventual takeover. No wonder the Chozo built Diggernaut kept attacking you. It wasn't malfunctioning. It was trying to stop you because it knew what would happen if you succeeded. That comment was written by a user named DracoBlade, and the A in Draco is 4, and the O in Draco is 0. His points make sense with the lore that we have now. While I disagree with the Geek Critique that this ruins the ending because of what DracoBlade said, I do agree that another small detail ruins a fun twist. When you exit the cave, presumably after backtracking with the baby Metroid, if you're doing a 100% run, instead of a beautiful starry sky, there's a storm. Now this in of itself is not a bad thing. It's just that it sort of clued me into the fact that there may or may not be more, even on my first playthrough. Lo and behold, Ridley shows up, looking like an in-between stage for his meta and her organic forms, and you fight him. This boss is hard without the lightning armor, and even with all the upgrades. Ridley does so much damage and moves so quickly. However, unlike every other boss in the game, his weak point is available at all times, and is literally all of his body. This is an all-out brawl, and the baby Metroid even helps in this fight. Ridley also tries to steal the baby Metroid here, a la Super Metroid, seeing as it is a precursor to Super. In fact, this game leads right into the events of Super. It should come as no surprise that I like both of these games. Yep, there's definitely not a third one that we talked about, but which is better in my eyes? Which one is worth your time? Well, both, but that's for different reasons. For this section, I'll be ignoring the AM2R as a free download. I'm going to act like you could buy both for the 3DS at retail price or $40. Honestly, I wish AM2R was on the 3DS or the Switch. The dev said he'd be happy to put it on Nintendo hardware if he could. And if I could, I would mod my new 3DS or Switch to run AM2R. I just don't trust myself with doing it. I may or may not get my console banned from online or just break it entirely. AM2R succeeds in being a faithful remake of Metroid 2 in the Zero Mission style. It adds a bunch of new quality of life changes and is very traditional with its layout and combat, as well as exploration focus. It also has a lot more skips and sequence breaks and a lot cooler and snappier movement. The controls in AM2R are also a lot more intuitive, and you can just jump right into it without needing a bit of time to adjust. The abilities here are also the best that I've seen. They blend well together and are pushed to their limits in their uses. The graphics also appeal to me more personally, as I'm a huge sucker for the DS and GBA styled sprite work, but I still think Samus Returns look incredible, especially in its suit designs. Speaking of, the rework designs in Samus Returns look exceptional, and I even own a shirt of the Varia suit from this game because it looks so good. The new abilities and combat mechanics make the game extremely fun. If this is what Other M felt like, and if Other M blended exploration and combat well, I feel like I'd be okay with the crap story. The fact that this game is now 3D meant that the world could feel a lot more deep and alive. Combat is more of a focus in this game and could be seen in the bosses. The few quality of life changes that they did are amazing, and the new map design kept it fresh for me even on my technical 4th visit to SR-388. Metroid 2 never existed, as they skipped it way back when, but if it were to exist, I feel like that the data tech and design makes it not worth playing unless you already have it, are morbidly curious, or are buying it on the 3DS Virtual Console. I would still recommend playing it in some capacity, however, if only to see how much better the remakes are in almost every level. So, what's the verdict? Which remake is better? Come on, you knew it would be a remake at the end of the day. Metroid 2 is just held back too much by its hardware that I didn't enjoy it as much as the other two. I wish I could give it the top spot, but I can't. Instead, I give it to AM2R. Don't worry though, it was very close. Very close. AM2R just appeals to me personally more. The presence of Zero Mission-esque speed booster puzzles alone is enough to put it on top for me. That's not even mentioning the incredible controls, amazing performance, and vibrant graphics. The fact that the game looks, plays, and runs so well, and it can still run on my crappy old laptop at max settings is still astounding. Samus Returns is great too, but for different reasons that don't appeal to me as much as AM2R does. Plus, frame drops and performance issues are common on the original 3DS models. AM2R to me is the perfect 2D Metroid game. Honestly, I would have put it on my top 10's games list, but I didn't feel right putting it on the list since it's a fan game. I promise you though, this is probably the definitive experience for not only Metroid 2, but Metroid in general. So, that's it. That's all I got. I can't stress enough that Samus Returns and AM2R are fabulous games. I urge you to get all 3 games listed here in some capacity. Seriously, please do. Like I said, that's all I got. So I guess I'll see you guys next time. Take care, guys. Hope you all are excited for Dread.